So when we turn our attention to the technical excerpt for bass clarinet, there's one important thing we have to note right away, and that's the marking in measure 3. So the simile indication there means to perform in a similar manner. And what does it apply to? In this particular instance, it's applying to the articulation. So if you look in measure 1 and measure 2, you note that there's a large slur over the entire measure, and then underneath that slur, there are 2 little slurs, each with 3 notes under them. That articulation should apply to every single measure in the excerpt. That's what the simile is indicating. So rather than rewriting the same articulation again and again and again and again, the composer just writes that one word and the performer applies it throughout the entire duration of however long it's supposed to go until the composer tells you to change. Okay? So every measure should be one large slur, and then underneath that, groups of 3 notes slurred together. When we look at those little groups of slurred notes, the need for the little slurs under the large slur arises from the fact that we really have to tongue beat 2, or the 4th eighth note. The indication should be interpreted to tongue lightly, because keep in mind, every measure is over a large slur. So rather than playing, we need to hear a little bit of light attack, a little bit of definition on beat 2. And like the lyrical study, there's no indicated place to breathe in this music. So we have to go fishing for some good spots. I would recommend the following spots. So obviously before we start, and then I would breathe at the end of measure 8. I would breathe at the end of measure 16. And if I needed one more before the end, I could sneak one in at the end of measure 20. All right? Some of you may not need that, but I would still pencil it in and maybe put a little parenthesis around it so that you know to take it there if needed. It's always better to plan your breathing, folks, so that you're not making it up on the fly during your audition for either chairs or for acceptance into the band. So make sure that you mark those and have a plan for your breathing. The most technical element of this technical etude comes in with the pinky fingers that we all have to fuss with as soprano and as bass clarinet players. So if we look at a couple things, let's look at measure 4. So here's a general rule that we should all know. G sharps, or A flats, in this case it's G sharp in measure 4, should always be played with the right hand pinky. That means that F sharp should be played with the left hand pinky, and the low E should be played with the right hand pinky. Okay? That's a rule about clarinet playing. We have G sharps or A flats should always be on the right, and then we figure out how to get to them or how to leave them after that. There's one possible exception to that rule that we could apply in this etude. So let's look at it. Measure 7. First of all, we need to realize something. It looks like we have a note that's out of our range. We look at the last note of measure 7, and you see it's a low D sharp. If you count all the ledger lines all the way down, we've got a low D sharp all the way down there. And we think that low D is a note that's typically outside of the clarinet range, and that's true. But low D sharp is enharmonic with the pitch E flat, which we do have in our range. So even though it looks like it might be out of range for the bass clarinet, it really isn't. What we have to do is just sort of run a translation in our head and understand that D sharp is the same pitch as E flat. And all of you who play bass clarinet, regardless of what model or brand you play, should have a low E flat key. And it'd be on your right side, bottom row, last key. We should all have a low E flat, regardless of what type of bass clarinet we play. So you all have that note. Depending on what type of bass clarinet you have, might dictate how you get through measure 7. So let's take a look at a couple of options. If you are fortunate enough to have a bass clarinet with the extended range down to low C, you can play this low D sharp on the right side, just like I showed you here. You can play the low E, so now I'm on the first note of measure 8. You can play the low E on the left side. You can play the F sharp on the right side, and then if you have the extended range, you should have a left hand G sharp key that you can grab. It's the highest key on your left pinky if you have a bass clarinet with extended range. Okay? This is what I did to get through this measure on the recording, because I have the extended range on my bass clarinet. So that's one exception to the rule about how you navigate the pinkies. The rule usually is that G sharps are always played with the right hand pinky. But here's one special circumstance, because we have this right hand note down here. We can get through it with this alternate G sharp key, if you have it. If you have the standard bass clarinet and you don't have the extended range or the extra key, you're going to have a little bit of a harder time doing this, but I have a suggestion for you that I think is going to help. So, I said to all of you just a second ago to breathe at the end of measure 8. If you have just the bass clarinet without the extended range, my suggestion to you would be to actually bump that breath back, right? And take it, rather than at the beginning or at the end of measure 8, to take it after the first note of measure 8. So breathe between the E and the F sharp. And that way you'll be able to reset your left hand pinky and get through there. So, all right, to get through there, right, you need to tongue 2 G sharps. Then you wouldn't breathe at the end of the measure. Okay? So again, if you have the extended range, it's a little tricky to grab this left hand G sharp, but you can do it. If you don't have the extended range, you're going to have to breathe and then sort of reset your fingers. Okay? Probably some of you have questions about that. I am happy to have you email me and address your specific concerns about that. That measure is very tricky for the fingers. What you should not do, ladies and gentlemen, is try to slide your fingers, because inevitably there'll be extra notes that happen in between the two that you're trying to get to. That is, I think, the hardest technical aspect of this etude. If you look just a little bit later, so note that measures 10 and 12 have a crescendo under them. So to help with this, what I would do is I would encourage you to start a little bit softer in bars 9 and 11 in order to help that crescendo really happen. It gives you a little bit more room to convey it. And also note that measure 14 continues the crescendo. So you need a big dynamic push between measure 13 and measure 16. Instead of just sort of crescendoing in pairs of 2 bars, now we have one long 4-bar crescendo. So you want to make sure that that's brought out and apparent. And then lastly, even though it's not indicated, just for musical effect, again, even though it's a technical study, we still want to hear elements of your musicianship. I would encourage you to do a small ritardando at the end. Just pull back the tempo a little bit so that we have a nice musical ending. Okay? good luck on this. I'm happy to hear questions or recordings as you have them. Please feel free to get a hold of me. Otherwise, good luck with your preparation.